Please join us every week for a new episode of Understanding the Human Condition with Dr. James Flowers. Dr. Flowers and his most admired mentors, respected colleagues, and VIP guests will share valuable insight into underlying health causes, conditions, and issues. These in-depth yet approachable episodes are a great resource for both private individuals and industry professionals. Our esteemed host, Dr. James Flowers, is one of the most recognized and respected names in the field of chronic pain, mental health, and substance use disorders, both nationally and internationally. Dr. Flowers is the founder of J. Flowers Health Institute, located in Houston, Texas. For more information about J. Flowers Health Institute and its concierge services, go to jflowershealth.com or dial 713-783-6655. And be sure to mention this podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to Understanding the Human Condition. I'm your host, Dr. James Flowers, and this is my lovely co-host, Robin French.
Hey, Dr. Flowers.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Happy post-4th weekend.
Oh, yeah. Did you have a good weekend?
I had a great weekend. I went out of town, and it was nice, good weather, as you can all see by my sunburn.
Yeah.
But it was a great weekend. How about you?
Awesome. Well, I had a full weekend. But I just say, wouldn't call it fun, but it was full.
You had a full weekend.
I did, indeed. And we have a special guest today, our very own Dr. Cesar Seveso. How are you?
Hello. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. So happy to be here.
Yeah,
glad
super
to have
glad
you
that you
on.
had time to join us. I know you're super busy at the office, and this was a great afternoon to do this, so thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and we really wanted to talk about the ripple effects of trauma. And you being our very own trauma therapists, this would be a great time to share what everybody's wanting to know more about.
Yeah.
Let's
do that. Yeah.
Well, first let's talk about your accent, though.
Of course.
Because I knew your accent.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Argentina.
Yeah.
I was born and raised in Argentina. I was joking earlier that I've been working on this accent for 40-something years.
Yeah, I said, how much is it? And
So
you said a lot.
Yes. That's where the accent comes from.
And so what brought you to Houston?
Well, I initially came to Houston about 10 years ago. There was an opportunity. I'm a clinical social worker, but before becoming a social worker, I was teaching. I have a PhD. I was doing research on political violence. And so I originally came to Houston because there was a teaching opportunity. And that was in my previous life, a little bit of my previous life. And I can tell you more about that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the reason why. But before coming to Houston, I lived in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I lived in Bloomington, Indiana.
Wow.
So I've been in the States for 21 years already.
Oh.
So
let's tell the audience about your education, a little bit about your background.
Yes, sure. I'd love to talk about that. So originally in Argentina, I was working as a reporter. I was working for a newspaper, working on political human rights issues. There was a point in time in Argentina there was a dictatorship, and I grew up during this 7-year-long dictatorship that ended in 1983.
Mm-hmm.
So during the 1990s, there were human rights trials going on, and working for this newspaper, I got to cover that. And as a result of my work as a reporter, I won a fellowship that brought me originally to New York City. I went to NYU, and I was living in New York City during 9/11. And this is all related to trauma. That's also why I'm saying this.
So you were living in New York City during 9/11?
I was living in New York City during 9/11. So that day, I was about to begin an internship with a newspaper. So I was doing a master's degree at NYU, and it was already planned. And I remember walking back to the apartment, and I was living within walking distance of the Twin Towers, and I remember seeing them on fire. And I went to the newspaper. I went to the newsroom, and I said, "Can I go? I would like to go." And they said, yes, go, you can go. And so I basically remember I had a notepad and I was walking down 6th Avenue and I got really close to the Twin Towers. It was a very painful, surreal experience of people. I mean, sometimes when we talked about trauma, or when people used to talk about trauma, they use this idea of shell shock, the people who were coming from war. So that was really, there was people in shock.
Sure.
And I myself was also in shock.
Sure.
So that was the beginning of my work on trauma. I became interested in how people can recover from this. I mean, some of the survivors of human rights abuses that I met in Argentina when I was working as a reporter, the people who died and the people who survived, how do they make sense of that? How do people make sense of the things that happened to them, the things that they've done to each other? So that took me to Bloomington, Indiana, when at the point I was writing a doctoral dissertation and doing qualitative research with survivors of people who had been detained in clandestine detention centers in Argentina, people who had been tortured, raped. And so that was the beginning of my approach to trauma. Making sense of pain and how people can recover from pain. Psychic pain, psychological pain, suffering, really.
Yeah.
So how long was it between the time of the Twin Towers collapsing and the time you went back to do your social work degree?
So we are talking about, so I was doing my dissertation, so probably about 10 years.
10
years of
yeah.
doing research and interviewing people and writing, publishing some articles. It was a fulfilling experience, yet at some point I wanted to do more. And I wanted to, I think that as a historian, I got really close to pain, the experience of being with someone who is in pain. But also with that came the feeling of, how can I really help this person right now? I'm going to write a book, I'm going to write an article, but how can I help this person who is crying in front of me, breaking down, not being able to make sense of what happened to them? So there was a lot about this. I don't have all the tools that I need.
Right.
And so that took me to social work, University of Houston, working with, initially I worked with homeless people who were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. And then from that I worked with people with advanced cancer, and then with young adults with personality disorders.
Yeah. So with all of that background and your own trauma, right, experiencing trauma even on 9/11, what kind of work have you done? And what's the importance of doing your own work for your own trauma and the effect of working and burnout?
That is very important.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about a secondary traumatization. Anyone who comes into contact with trauma, whether you are a therapist or not, you are going to be... This is the ripple effect of trauma, really. Trauma, there are two things. Whatever happened, and then how people are coping with that. And us seeing people who have experienced trauma, and some of them have experienced trauma for years, and some of them, they never talked about trauma. And when all that comes up, it is difficult not to feel that pain. And so it is a very important part of whoever works on trauma, to be able to, a little bit to role model what you do exactly, what you tell your patient, your client to do. It's about, and for us also supervision is very important, and self-care is really important, and being able to monitor ourselves. And some of the trauma that we see, or probably most, I would say, of the trauma that we see, happens in the context of interpersonal relationships. So trauma work, important part of trauma work, happens in the context of my relationship as a clinician, as a therapist with the trauma survivor. So it is important that I take care of me, because at some point this relationship is going to play a very important role in someone else recovering from trauma.
Sure, exactly. You know, speaking of going from New York and talking about the 9/11 tragedy in the buildings, there was recently, just a couple of weeks ago, the building collapsed in Florida.
Yes.
And there were people, it was 1:30 in the morning, people in the building, half of the building or more collapsed and left part of it standing. There was trauma, obviously, from the people falling, the families around the world that were traumatized, seeing it on the news over and over and over again, wondering what if their loved ones were alive or dead. And then now the second part of the building being demolished on July 4th. And people were even traumatized because their animals were in the building, and they wouldn't let them go in and get the animals out of the building. Talk about the trauma and the ripple effects from just that Florida incident that we've just experienced.
Yes. So part of it is really, there are a lot of reminders that we might have. I was talking about the Twin Towers before, so I think that, and before that, Oklahoma bombing. So the idea that can happen, and we tend to make these associations. And now we have access, because of media, Twitter, anything else, we can almost be there as things are happening. So there is something to, and that is quite new, I mean, or quite recent. Before someone else experiencing something like this in Buenos Aires, I would find out, but I wouldn't necessarily be able to see and follow that on real time. So there is the experience of that. And with that, I also, a major difference with most of the trauma that we see is that particularly one in Florida is sort of an impersonal trauma. You cannot, you cannot blame someone else, particularly some other person, for what happened. And I'm going to compare that to childhood trauma. So if your father is sexually abusing you, that's an interpersonal trauma, and there is an attachment bond that is real, and the person who is supposed to take care of you is at the same time the person who is sexually or physically abusing you. What happened in Florida is different. It's a different kind of trauma. It is also important to say that some people not necessarily are going to develop a trauma disorder. In fact, many people can recover from trauma on their own. And then there is the other part of the people who are doing the work of rescuing, the reporters who are covering that, the first responder. Everybody else who is impacted. I mean, even people from Argentina, I know that they are following the news because there were some Argentinians who are living or were happen to be in this very same building at the time when it collapsed. So there is the ripple effect of trauma, and that is really what we are always looking into as clinicians. It's about what happened, and then the ripple effect of this trauma over time to the person, to the family system. Intergenerational trauma is something also that we talked about a lot.
That's right.
So it's
what should families look for in a loved one that may have experienced trauma in the past? What are signs of trauma, and what should moms, dads, loved ones look for in family members?
That's a very important question. And there are 4 things that people should be paying attention to. So number 1 is people who have experienced one or more traumatic events, and people who tend to develop what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Number 1, they are going to be reliving the memories of what happened to them. They're going to keep coming up. Although they try to push them down and away, they're going to keep coming up. And that is number 2, the pushing down and away, the avoidance. Even sometimes it means avoidance of people and places that are going to remind you of the trauma that you experienced at a certain point in your life. The other one is more about behaviors. You're going to see a lot of hypervigilance, a lot of anger that you don't know necessarily where it might be coming from, and difficult to there are triggers that some people are going to be able to see, but may or may not be related to the trauma. And then there is another one that's more about the thoughts. What the person who has been traumatized, what they think about themselves. A lot of shame and guilt. I am broken. This happened because I somehow I deserve it. Maybe I have done something in the past. So all of these things are coming up. So what we are talking about here is a person for whom it's going to be very difficult to feel that anything around you really matters. It's going to be difficult for you to love and to be able to take care of others. It's going to be able to get a sense of who you are and your identity, and get into romantic or develop. I'm not talking about just romantic relationships, but the ability to develop friendships and be able to trust others. When we are going through trauma, our brain is going to. Our brain is very sensitive, and so our brain is going to adapt to that. And this is a normal reaction. We're going back to the idea that when there are in certain situations there is a fight, flight, or freeze. This is really how our brain is going to work. But for people who have been traumatized, the brain tends to get stuck in that. That's the survival brain. And the work of therapy is really, on the one hand, paying attention to the survival brain, even in therapy, when I'm seeing a client, what is the body language? How is this person reacting to some of the things that I'm saying? And then the other part is really nurturing the other brain, the living brain, the brain who is still looking and hoping to find a connection, the resilient part of that person that has not been damaged by the trauma.
Now, do women react to trauma differently than men?
That's a very interesting question. And really what we know is that women experience a different type of trauma. Not necessarily that they react different. They tend to report the same symptoms. And in DSM-5, the guidebook that we use in order to diagnose people with a post-traumatic stress disorder, there are a certain number of symptoms that you have to meet. But really what we see is that women, they tend to experience what some people call high impact trauma. This is the trauma of sexual abuse. And women are much more exposed than men to this type of trauma. Now, for example, we know that 1 in 4 girls are going to be sexually abused before the age of 17. Men, it's 1 in 20. Wow. So that is something to really keep in mind. We also know that it's important to pay attention to the trauma that happens during childhood. That is a trauma that is very likely going to have long-lasting consequences throughout the lifespan of these particular persons throughout their lives. That is the type of trauma that really we need to pay attention to. And also we know that there are certain populations who are more likely to develop what we call complex trauma. This is sort of an ongoing, not part of the DSM-5 also. So which are the populations that we need to pay attention to? One is male survivors of sexual abuse. They are more likely to develop complex trauma. LGBTQI youth. Homeless individuals, people who have who have experienced ongoing, repeated trauma. So sometimes we're talking about trauma events. One thing happened. Florida, someone pointed a gun at me. These are sort of one event. We're talking about just one event. But the type of complex trauma, the very significant trauma that we see many times, is the trauma that happens over time. And certain populations are more likely to be exposed to this type of violence, the fear of death.
How do children and adolescents react to trauma? Do they Is it different than being an adult?
Yes, it is different. Children are severely impacted by trauma. Children are severely impacted by trauma. That doesn't have to be underestimated. I think when we think about trauma and trauma disorders, sometimes we think about people coming back from a war. And this is really how we, in the 1970s, we became aware that there was something that we today call post-traumatic stress disorder. A group of Vietnam veterans, at that point it was called post-Vietnam syndrome. And this is how it made it into the DSM-5 in 1980 as an official diagnosis, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. But really, what we see, and it is important to continue paying attention to that, and also the trauma that is happening to children. Right now, Child Protective Services is receiving about 3 million per year, I'm talking about per year, 3 million reports of childhood sexual abuse or neglect or any other form of severe abuse. So just imagine that, 3 million reports per year.
Do you think that was happening all along and people just weren't talking about it before? What's your thoughts on that?
It's hard to say. I think that we are becoming more and more aware that there is something called trauma, that it is important to, that it is not a sign of weakness if it happened to you, that it can happen to anyone. We have more resources to be able to report when something like that happens. There is more awareness. Yep. Certainly, I mean, that's might be part of the picture that we see right now. We have more ways to keep track the trauma but really, the trauma has been around forever too. Yeah. It's only that we became aware
and we're recognizing it more.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
What are some of the new trauma research findings that you're seeing right now in research?
This would require another podcast in itself. It is a very exciting time for anyone working on trauma. It is very, very exciting. Probably like never before, there have been so many people working on trauma. But I would like to say 3, 4, or maybe 5 areas that we need to continue sort of paying attention to. And these are the areas where we are going to see what people are doing research at some point is going to impact the care that we provide. So one very, very exciting and sort of brand new, it's the use of psychedelics to treat trauma.
Sure.
So this is one where even people like Van der Kolk, who is one of the leading experts on trauma, have been working on that. The other one is sort of neurobiological research. Really, what we are knowing more and more and more is really how abuse and neglect impact our brain, and how trauma therapy can help create new pathways and activate different areas of our brain. Together with that, also we're paying a lot of attention to biology, and brain is connected to our nervous system. So we are looking more into people like Porges, the polyvagal system and theory, really how going back to the fight, flight, or freeze, how that is. And then the other one, mindfulness. I mean, this is the way really I'm thinking about Tai Chi, meditation, mindfulness, drumming. These are the ways in which people sort of were taking care of the trauma when clinicians were not around. And we are seeing, I mean, we're paying a lot of attention to the connection between mind and body, brain and body. And this is sort of very, very exciting. And then the other part of going more into traditional therapies, couples therapy, intergenerational family system dynamics, really looking into how trauma is being reproduced across generations or in relationships. So that also plays a very significant role in the work that we are doing.
Are you doing any EMDR work?
I'm not right now, but we do. Yep. We do at Flowers, yes.
Yep, absolutely.
That has been one of the sort of the well-known interventions for trauma. It works.
Yep.
So yeah.
Well, something you are
Right.
doing is you have an upcoming project that you're working on with leading trauma experts in the field of trauma.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell everyone about that.
I'm very excited about it. So I'm about to begin in a couple of weeks, 7-month long training with some of the leading experts on trauma. I mean, it's just a unique opportunity to work with the people who were at the very beginning of our understanding of trauma back to in the early 1980s, and the people who are today doing the research that is going to lead to new therapies.
Amazing.
So just to be around these people and to get to talk with them, to get to see them, to get to learn from them,
That's
it is a unique experience. I'm very excited about it. It's
You can tell.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
You're
That's
doing it in
amazing.
person or Zoom?
It's going to be Zoom. You
Yeah.
know, it's going to be
Okay.
Zoom. Yes, that's another thing that you couldn't probably get all of these people into the same room.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
they're
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
true.
they are
Yeah.
very busy. They live not only here in the States. Some of them live abroad. So just to
That's
get
so
them,
cool.
all of them, yes,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
So is it possible that someone had trauma but didn't realize that they had trauma, and then it just kind of bubbles up one day? I mean, I remember we had a patient that she just woke up one night with anxiety. And is it because she probably had trauma and wasn't addressed, and it just bubbles up and...
Yeah, that is possible. I mean,
Yeah.
tr-
I don't remember the case, but
Yeah,
it's
it just
certainly
happened out of the
possible.
blue,
Yeah,
you know, in her
absolutely.
50s. And yeah,
and I think probably if that happened also, I would say that it is because that person was in an environment as that allowed for that person to feel safe enough. That then not only that person experienced that, but then
Right.
came to the office and said, you know, this happened this morning. I woke up and now I'm having all of these feelings that I was not aware. So I think that part of it again is really what happens during the trauma, and then what happens to people after the trauma.
Yeah.
And who are the people who are around that person? And really sometimes
Yeah.
that makes the difference. And I
Yeah.
would say that probably that person felt safe. In
Yes.
trauma treatment, there are 3 stages. And the first one is safety. The
Yeah.
person has to feel safe.
yeah,
Physically safe, emotionally safe. The person has to be able to trust.
yeah,
I mean, I'm not going to open up about my trauma if I feel that
Right.
somehow I'm not safe here.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I would say that there was safety in that person at that moment.
yeah,
And then allow that person to go to a therapist and to say, you know what? This is painful and I want to talk to you about it.
yeah. But that's the type of person that come to J. Flowers, right? So maybe you can explain to the audience briefly, Dr. Flowers, about a comprehensive diagnostic evaluation and why someone would need that.
Well, I think it's important to mention that a part of our 360-degree comprehensive diagnostic evaluation, that a trauma evaluation is such an important component, because not all of us realize that we have trauma or how trauma impacts our daily lives,
Right, right.
So we want that trauma evaluation to be a part of that comprehensive approach, to look and have a better, clearer understanding of really who we are and or what our true experiences have been. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of, what are your thoughts on this podcast title, Understanding the Human Condition? What does that mean to you?
No, it means a lot to me. And I was reminded about, there is a psychiatrist I really like. His name is Irving Yalom. And he wrote a book called Labs Executioner. And in that book, he talks about us therapists. And he says, you know, we shouldn't talk about them, our patients, them and their problems. This is about us and our problems. And that's the human condition, really, because all of us, whether I am a clinician or a patient or a client, all of us, we are dealing with love, sadness, anger, loss, freedom, fear. I mean, those are known to me as much as they are known to you and to you.
Right.
Those,
Absolutely.
and so we are in this sort of corner of the universe called Houston, doing this very intensive work with being able to develop a relationship that is going to allow a person to open up really about being human, about curiosity, about connection, about understanding what I feel, about resilience. I mean, and this is truly what makes us human.
Right.
The ability, I mean, to relate to each other, to feel your pain, to be able to do something together, make sense, make meaning out of terrible experiences that many of our clients went through. So I think that I mean, to work exactly in that corner of the universe where you are doing that very intensive.
That's right.
I mean, that is really what the privilege of being human.
Yeah, absolutely.
Being
I think we should have him on every week.
Right? Yeah. Well,
right.
everyone who's listening or watching, you can tell why we're just so excited to have you with us.
Yeah.
And we know that you're a man who had a lot of different choices as to where you wanted to work, and the fact that you chose us is
very excited to,
says a lot.
to be here.
Really
Right.
happy to have you with us. So if anyone wants to reach any of us really at J Flowers Health Institute, go to jflowershealth.com.
Yep.
And you can also call us at 713-783-6655.
And you'll get to meet these two wonderful gentlemen.
We would love
and
to
work
visit with
them.
you.
And I'd like to remind everyone watching or listening to us that there's numerous platforms to find our podcast: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. Please share this episode on social media. Like it, share it, subscribe.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
joining
Doctor.
us
Thank
today.
you so much. Thank you for having me
you
here.
bet.
Thank you.
Thank you so
And
much.
we want to remind you a clear diagnosis is the key to the most effective treatment possible. See you next week.
See you guys.
See you.